We already know how this is like. No, just it'll be easier.
Every holiday.
Yeah, 100%.
Hey everyone, hello, welcome. We're going to get started. So I will start by acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples have always been making discoveries and sharing knowledge as we are today. And our speaker today is Sam. I cannot say his last name very well, but I'll try. Schwarzkopf. Yes. So it is a bit embarrassing because we've known each other. Actually, that's the embarrassing bit. We've known each other for 16 years. I checked with Sam that it was okay to say that. He said it's okay because it's embarrassing for both of us. And it's also a fact of life. So we overlapped at UCL that long ago. Also, we overlapped with Iroaz. Sorry, I'll embarrass you now as well. It was much later. Much later.
Much later.
So I am really excited to have Sam visit all the way from Auckland. So he's since moved to Auckland. So let me do this properly. So Sam studied basic neuroscience at Cardiff University and then did his PhD also at Cardiff, investigating the early postnatal development of the visual cortex. In 2007, he did his first postdoc at the University of Birmingham, where he researched perceptual learning with fMRI. He then moved to the FIL and ICN at University College London, where he developed an interest in subjective perception and population receptive field methods, which is where we met. In 2013, he started his own lab at UCL in experimental psychology. Finally, in 2017, he saw the light and moved to the Southern Hemisphere to take up a position at University of Auckland. And I tried to say Auckland in the Indigenous language, but I can't say it, so Sam will say it.
Samakimakoro.
That.
Sometimes say it, but not always.
So I am really delighted to have you here and really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for having me. And so we actually recently had a visitor from Melbourne who told me that the original name of this place is Nam. So I'm really pleased to be here now. Right, so what I'm going to tell you about is actually a bit of an overview, and it goes back to the time when I knew about her first, when we shared an office at UCL. But yeah, I try not to rehash really old things by my standard. So, but you know, I had to start somewhere. So the past 15 years or so, I have been interested in studying why we see things as large or small. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to give you the answer to this question, but it's the question that motivates the talk. And I hope we made some steps forward in actually better understanding this. It's not the only thing I do, and actually I recently moved away from doing a lot of things on size, but yeah, it's still a question that interests me, and this should actually have worked. Okay, in that case, so why do you actually want to study size? It seems like a very simple thing that, you know, why haven't we figured this out yet? So size is actually quite important, you know, for pretty much everything that our visual system is for, and that what we try to do when we interact with the world, we need to know how big things are, right? Such as when you try to find the right lid that goes on one of these jars, you know, you need to be able to somehow infer that and work that out. And then it can have really significant consequences. So here, I grew up in a small town in Germany, and as people, I don't know how many of you come from countries like European or Asian countries or the Middle East, where places are very old. So in my hometown, there are buildings that were built hundreds of years before any people lived in New Zealand, right? So this is the difference between the kind of places that where I find myself now and the kind of environment that I grew up in. So this building here, this is a old town gate. That's not quite that old. It was built maybe 100 or 200 years after first Maori arrived in New Zealand. But yeah, there are some older builds, but there's a good reason I put this building here. So you see here, yeah, it's an old town gate. So there's this gate, and you see these flower pots in front of it. And before I went to university, before I moved to Britain, I worked for a few years as a paramedic driving ambulances. And back then, this was actually the road. There were two roads, but one lane was going through the gate. And if you look at these bricks on the side of the gate, you see there's a lot of damage, and that's from all the cars that used to hit this gate. And at some point, the city decided, let's not let people drive through there anymore. It was a very good decision, but it was always a skill. And if you did this with the ambulance, you know, ambulance is pretty wide, so it's quite a hard judgment task for how do I aim this car through this gate. And if you hit it, then you have to buy a cake for everyone. So they're saving a lot of cake now, but it's just one example where, you know, your judgment of how big things are and how to align things are really important. And the other thing that we know is, like a lot of things in our perception of size of objects is not actually veridical, right? Our perception of the world is constructed by the brain. And it's influenced by all sorts of factors. And so a very famous illusion is this one. Is, we believe, a variant of what's called the Ponzo illusion, but you see here these three cars are, of course, retinally exactly the same. If you look at the pixel size, exactly the same, but the one in front looks almost like a toy, and this one looks huge, right? So the context and the environment in which we put stimuli, it really influences how large they appear. And there are many examples of this. So these are all these sort of geometric size illusions that, you know, have been around for quite a while. And I'm not going to go through them all in depth, but tell that these circles of these two in the top, Ebbinghaus and the Duff illusion, they're of course again the same size, and they should distinctly look different, right? Same thing here, the lines, horizontal lines in those illusions are exactly the same length, but the context makes them look different. And there are various explanations for these, but they're certainly, the way they're constructed is simple, right? And they look quite like they're geometric effects. But of course, you could interpret this as sort of a perspective. You're seeing a railway track or road. And similar explanations have been made for this one, that it has something to do with our perspective taking. So the question whether these are simple or maybe not so simple is not really that clear. And then this is the Ebbinghaus, which I spent quite a lot of time studying myself. That is sometimes in the literature called size contrast, because, you know, this circle here looks much smaller than that circle. And, you know, the contrast idea is that it looks smaller here because it's surrounded by really big things, and it looks larger here because it's surrounded by really small things. But we already know that that's not true. So when I take away the small ones here and actually compare to the isolated baseline case, if you will, it clearly looks smaller. I think, you know, you probably see that. But in the opposite case, I think you'll probably find it harder to make that distinction. So maybe this one looks bigger than that one, but maybe you disagree. And that's actually what we find, that, you know, people are not always agreeing that that one makes it look bigger. So it's not necessarily a contrast, right? It's not actually just the size of the things surrounding it, but it's possibly something much simpler. And on that note, so that's the stuff that I did back, and we've glossed over the, actually, it's also a more important one, and the younger one is missing. But this is stuff I did when I knew Marta.
I'm on one of those dots.
Quite possibly you're one of those dots, yes. But all I want to say here is that we did these studies back then, And there was the splashy one that came first, and then there was the much better one that came a bit later, where we found that the strength of that Ebbinghaus illusion correlates inversely with how much surface area there is in your primary visual cortex, the area V1. And that's the first place in the cortex where the visual input is received by the cortex. And so it's regarded, obviously it's already doing quite a lot of processing, and processing happens before, but it's considered part of the early visual processing. So that sort of implies it's not something complex about, happening, interpreting depth and all those kind of things that must require some more higher level cognition. So yeah, there's some suggestion that at least some of these illusions, right, are actually mediated by this sort of early level processing. And there's other evidence that points towards this. So there actually a psychophysics study, and that was actually done while I was still doing my PhD. I was not thinking about things like this at all. So that's even older. So here, these people, they measured this illusion as well as the Delboeuf, which is the one with just the circle. And they varied all sorts of parameters. And for example, one parameter that they did vary is the inducer distance to the target. So, the surrounding elements, how far away they are from the target. And what they found again, so things that are below here in the red zone, they are perceived as smaller. So when you have large inducers surrounding it, it's pretty obvious, that one. I showed you an example. That one just generally looks smaller. But with these small inducers, that's the squares here. So in that case, actually, it really depends on how far away the inducers are, what you perceive. And so there are situations where when they're pretty close, then yes, you do see it as bigger, but when they're further away, you actually also see it as smaller. And that curve is pretty closely following what happens with the Delboeuf illusion. So that's the one that you just have to circle around it. And so they argued, and there's more evidence in this paper, but they basically argued that the Ebbinghaus and Delboeuf are sort of manifestations of the same thing. But if you think about it, the circle in the Delboeuf at the top, let's see if we get the reach. That this circle here, you could just think of this as lots of small inducers, lots of small circles together, right? But that's basically what they're finding. So, you would expect that that's really more or less manifestation of the same thing. And you also see that the curve it's not very clear and not very steep rise, but actually there is a relationship of inducer distance also for the big ones. So you probably never reach a point, but it looks like if you could make these really, really close, you would actually overestimate the size too. So it's really, that sort of really invalidates this whole idea that it's about contrast of sizes, right? It's actually something much simpler. It's just about distances and geometric relationships. Oh, I did not expect it to come out like this. But so hopefully you can see it anyway. So this is a study that my then PhD student, Tassi Gorada, did. So he actually replicated those results pretty much. It's showing basically the same thing. We have these kind of curved relationships for the small and large inducers in the Ebbinghaus for target inducer distance. The stimuli were somewhat different, but it's showing the same relationships. But our motivation for that study was really to study how that idea that it could be related to early visual processing in V1. And so the idea that we try to test is, rather than looking at these correlations where we need to have really large groups of people to really get meaningful results, and you're probably shaving at the bottom end of what is really needed in those studies we did. That might not be the ideal approach to take. So instead, we wanted to see is actually the prediction we're making is that the cortical magnification in V1, so how much cortical territory, how much surface area is devoted to the visual field, whether that can predict the illusion, right? And that basically that we can look at the transformation of the stimulus, the relationships between the inducers and the target, and all, how the stimuli are constructed, and how they would be represented in V1, and whether there is actually a relationship. And that is something that doesn't require individual differences anymore, because we need to really know simply what these relationships are between cortex and visual space. And so this is the first step for doing this. The other thing he did was, so of course, when you want to vary the distance between target and inducers, one thing to do is just vary the distance target and inducers, right, in visual space. But because of cortical magnification, there's actually another way we can vary the distance in cortex, right? So when you keep the physical distance on the screen the same, but we put the stimuli at different locations in the visual field, we know that the cortical distance actually changes. And so that's the flip experiment that he basically done. So he put the same illusion at, he kept the distances fixed, right? But then put it in different locations in the visual field. And here again, we find it's relatively subtle, but there is a relationship, and it's actually more pronounced for the small inducers between what the cortical distance is between the target's inducers and the illusion strength that you're experiencing. And so what we can then do is to actually transform this. So before we're looking at these physical screen dimensions, but now we actually look, as a transformation of what would the distance between target and inducers be in the cortex. And then when you combine the two experiments, so that's the filled symbols are the ones where we varied the visual field location. You actually see that this is a relatively good explanation of what's going on. So that if you change the cortical distance, the illusion actually gets weaker. And that's the case for both configurations, the small and the large inducers. And he did the same thing also for the Delbeth, where the curves look a bit different, but I mean, it's also a different stimulus, right? It's not quite the same thing. It's really just a ring around the target. But you see this, so this was actually, we generally were more like expecting, right, that we get this sort of difference of Gaussian type shape, right? That there's a facilitator, like an increase of perceived size when you're close. And then when you go further away, that you underestimate the size. And then at some point it should go back to normal, because obviously if you put the inducer in a light-year way, we're not seeing it, it shouldn't have an effect, right? The interesting thing is that we did put it quite far away and it still has an effect. So this shrinking in perceived size is very powerful across the visual field. But so in any case, so we find very similar relationships here. But then just the red curve was another thing to sort of test that idea that the two illusions are similar things. So this green one is just a standard Delbeth. The red one is a Delbeth with a double ring, where it's not like that on the screen here, because there's any point in trying to do this. These two rings were basically designed to mimic the width of the inducers in the large Ebbinghaus. So what we wanted to test is whether anything we're seeing here is actually a fact that due to the fact that we have these big stimuli, where obviously before we said we vary the distance, but what does that mean, right? So here the close edge is very close, but the far edge is actually quite far away. So we just try to do a Delbeth version of that to see if that sort of mimics the same thing. And that seems to do that, right? Again, it's not showing this exact same relation, they're quite different curves. You still get this quite clear increase in perceived size when it's really close. But on the whole, there's the addition of a second ring clearly reduces perceived size across the board. So all this sort of suggests that at least for these two illusions, right, we do see something that's really quite low level, right? It's something that could involve V1, I mean, some of that could actually be earlier than V1, but it's pointing at least to to that kind of low-level early stage of processing. I'm going to change tack a little bit. So part of these studies were actually motivated by earlier studies already. Right? So in the mid-noughties, Frank Fang and Kirsten and Scott Murray, they did a series of studies where they studied this visual illusion. So here, again, this is like the car image I showed you earlier. But in this sort of implied 3D context, you should see the two rings as this one much closer, and so it looks small, and the one that's far in the corridor looks larger. And what they showed, that there's a reason they had these checkerboards that were flickering that allowed them to measure the brain activity in V1 with fMRI. And they showed that in terms of the width of the stimulus, as it is implied by the brain activity in V1, it actually reflects what people perceive, not just the input from the eyes. And since then, so they did other studies where they looked at it with receptive fields. And then there's been a number of other studies that showed very similar things, that the perceived size of stimuli actually seems to, that produces activity in V1 that reflects that perception of the veridical size of the objects. So there's Irina Sperendeo, in fact, that is her in the scanner. They had a very complicated contraption where they measured the perceived size of after images. And then there was another study where they looked at just adapting to size, where you just show a large stimulus, and then afterwards you show a medium-sized stimulus. It then looks smaller than it actually is, and vice versa. And again, that seems to be reflected in these V1 signals. So there's a lot of different kinds of size perception effects that seem to be reflected in the activity of V1, how it's like how the activity in the retinotopic map in V1, how it suggests the size of the object. And then my PhD student back in London, that was before my move, she also did a similar experiment where we wanted to do this for this Miller-Lyer illusion. So for reasons that are more technical, we use this kind of dot version. It's not actually the arrows that you see normally, but just these these constructed dots. And the thing that you can't see here, but these dots here, which are of course the targets that we're normally judging, but the corners of the arrow, they were flickering, right? And there were ways to try to take out the signal of the other black dots that are not flickering. So what we're trying to measure is the activation caused by those two target dots, not the whole thing. And then we used population receptive field mapping to project back the brain activity of these stimuli in V1, and we also looked at other areas, but V1 is here the key area because of all this literature. So we project that back into the visual field. So just, talk about in depth what all of this means, but basically if you have voxels in V1, right, we know for each voxel which bit of the visual field it corresponds to. And now we take the brain activity in all the voxels and then plot them back in the visual field. That's basically what that is. And so this is a view of the visual field, but where the brain activity is. And as you can see, so for the two stimuli, location of the actual target is implied by these circles. You see that for the one that looks actually bigger, further apart, we also have the clusters of activity that are shifted quite substantially outwards. It's less clear, but it's shifted inwards in this case, right? But it's certainly different from that one. Now, you can probably still see that here, so you see those tails, common tails kind of thing. So it does still imply something that might be related to the actual context stimuli. And Mandy did quite a lot of extra controls to sort of reduce and tease this apart. So we're pretty confident that there is an effect, that's not just caused by these context dots, right? It's not just the activity of that. As I said, the whole design was trying to get rid of them, but even if we didn't get rid of them completely, if you quite robustly remove anything that could be a likely influence of them, the effect's still there, but it gets weaker, right? So it's possibly possible that some of this is reflecting that activity from the other dots, but certainly not all of it. Nevertheless, our main interpretation in the end of this was that this is probably quite a low-level effect too, right? So that it is something to do with that are low-level interactions that are not just the activation of the dots, but it's the filtering of the image by the early visual cortex that actually produces these effects. And so at least if you use this kind of Müller-Lyer illusion, we think that that's just a very low-level effect. But keep that in mind because things get more complicated. Because now that is after my move across to New Zealand, and actually much more recent. So I have a PhD student who started, but she didn't with me now a year, but she did some interning before, and that was actually part of what she did then. So we wanted to test, again, we go into individual differences, but actually just looking at psychophysics, at the perception of the stimuli. We wanted to test it, what's actually a relationship between these different, possibly low-level illusions. And there have been studies like this before, but they sort of, they compare different illusions, but they're really like comparing apples and pears and oranges. Right? So what we try to do is match these kind of illusions as much as possible in terms of their low-level characteristics. There's a limit to what you can do. If you match one thing, then something else becomes unmatched, and it's not that straightforward. But on the whole, the sort of distances are the kind of things that I've been talking about before. This is what we try to compare here, and especially for compared to Dilbert in the Ebbinghaus, the size of this Medusa ring is exactly where the centers of these larger users would have been, and basically, that's sort of the idea. All right, and so what we did, we measured these illusions and the simple discrimination tasks as well, just to see how good people actually are at these kind of judgments, and then compared as a correlation matrix of the illusion strength between all the different conditions. And so one of the first sort of question, these are symbols are base factors, not p-values. So this is the comparison of the Dilbert and the Ebbinghaus, and this is the one where, based on all these things I've been discussing, going back to the 2005 study, it was before my time, that people argued that this is actually the same thing, right? It's the same illusion, just manifesting slightly differently because you're not using the exact same image, but it's the same underlying effect. And so our hypothesis was that if that's true, that should actually correlate really well, and it turns out it is, right? So that's actually reassuring. But then the interesting thing is that, so we found, especially for the Ponzo illusion, which in our version was sort of sideways, so that's maybe a bit different from the way it's most typically shown, like a road, right? But at least when you do it like this, and we have the same circle targets, all the same distances, actually there is quite a lot of correspondence between that illusion and the other two as well. So at least under these conditions, I think there's quite a lot of things shared, and that could, that if they had something to do with low-level processing, that would imply that probably that one is as well, right? And that's sort of somewhat interesting because with that one, people have, including us in the past, had various findings that sort of implied maybe they require sort of more high-level feedback connectivity, because it is some sort of a perspective effect, right? It implies something is further away, and so that requires more processing that we can get with low-level V1 or LGN or something like that. So that's interesting. It's not, there are actually more low-level things in that one probably than we expected. Then here with the Müller-Lyer, I mean, they're not using circles, so that could be one issue, right? But in other ways, we try to match this as much as possible. These arrows, or the horizontal lines rather, they're exactly the same lengths as the circles, or the same widths as the circles. And yeah, here we basically find nothing compellingly correlated with these other illusions. Right? So most of them actually supporting the null hypothesis, they're clearly not correlated. And so that is somewhat surprising if like the results that Mandy had with her version, where we interpret this, it's a lot of it is driven by low-level effects. If these are the low-level effects, maybe they're not the same low-level effects as the other ones have, right? So, of course, here we use the classical one with lines and arrows, and maybe there's more going on in this case than with the dots. So that would be one thing we don't know. But the take home from this really is that, so we know that some of these illusions really share mechanisms, because there may be other mechanisms that are not shared, but there's certainly a fair bit of variance explains from one illusion to the other. Okay. Now, changing tack a little bit again, but now here is a study from one of my PhD students just about to finish, waiting for a viva, that been happening over the past years in Auckland. And so she looked at, she's interested in size perception, but we wanted to go back to really some basics here. So it's related to size, as you see why in a minute, but in this study, we wanted to look at processing of spatial frequency. We're really the most basic thing you can think of in terms of what V1 or early visual cortex, early visual stages of processing are doing. So the way we wanted to study this is with population receptive field mapping. Again, go a bit over what that does without going into depth in a minute. But more importantly, in spatial frequency, I wanted to use adaptation as a way to see if adapting to spatial frequency has an effect on the processing in the early visual cortex. And so if you just keep your eyes sort of steady on the middle here, somewhere along the line, and just keep them there for a while, and I'll get a drink. Okay, you ready? So hopefully you noticed that when the image changed, that it should have been, so it should have been like a flip, right? What was blurry before suddenly became quite sharp, and what was sharp before became blurry. And then that fades fairly quickly. But that is basically a demonstration of adapting to spatial frequencies, like how coarse or fine the visual pattern is. It's a fundamental visual feature, and we know that neurons are tuned to that. And so if you adapt to a lower spatial frequency, it actually shifts the perception of frequently presented images to be away from that spatial frequency. So to be higher or lower, depending on what the adapter is. And there are good reasons to link this to receptive fields and the sort of processing, exactly the kind of filtering that might be underlying some of these illusions, right? So we know in the early visual cortex, like V1, V1 has receptive fields that look something like this, at least the simple cells do. They have these subcomponents in their receptive fields that respond to either stimulation or the absence of stimulus, and they're oriented and whatnot. But the important thing to see is that basically they're responding to patterns like these. Now, these have that's a low spatial frequency, that's a high spatial frequency, but that is related, it's directly linked to the size of the receptive field. They scale together. That's not the case in some higher regions, but in these early regions, that is the case, right? That we know small receptive fields seem to be linked to high spatial frequency processing. And so when you do adaptation, idea was basically this, that we can't measure individual receptive fields with neurons, but we can measure population receptive fields. So the receptive field of a voxel containing thousands, if not millions, of neurons. So what we expect would happen for the receptive field of the voxel, that if you, normally you would have a whole bunch of different sizes of receptive fields of neurons in a voxel, and they combine to give a voxel receptive field of a particular size. But then when you adapt to low spatial frequency, you're knocking out all those really large ones. and it leaves only these ones. And so the aggregate receptive field becomes smaller, and vice versa. When we adapt to high spatial frequency, we're losing the little ones, and so the aggregate becomes bigger. And then with population receptive field mapping, we basically have these stimuli that go through the visual field. It's not really that important, but the key thing is that we integrated the adaptation design into what we do for retinal topic mapping, just to get these receptive fields. And what that showed is, it's not that obvious in the maps, because we had to battle with the reviewer on convincing them that it's actually really visible. But these are the kind of retinotopic maps that the method is mainly for, right? We're actually identifying areas, and it doesn't matter how you adapt, right? The areas that come out are pretty much the same. So we wouldn't expect those to change, but it's good that they don't. But the key thing is that the receptive field size, it does change. So when you adapt to high spatial frequency patterns, you actually enlarge the receptive fields. So you see more yellows and less blue in this map than in that map. Whoops. And as I said, it's not necessarily that clear in the maps, but it's clear when you look for it. But you're looking at the actual quantitative data, it becomes very obvious, and it becomes particularly obvious in area V2, which could be because of the size of the patterns that we use. It might be particularly well tuned for that. That's an open question, but we did find it across many of the early visual areas. So basically, when you adapt to high spatial frequency, it increases the receptive field size. So that, that could imply that there is some link. For one thing, we show that the population receptive field size seems to be related to spatial frequency processing, but it could also link those kind of low-level effects of the illusions. That's actually something to do with receptive field sizes in V1 and those other areas. Okay, but obviously that can't be the whole story, right? So we know that some things are low level, fine, but Ejim also wanted to do actually look at what could be the role of feedback in these kind of more complicated illusions. So these are various stimuli she constructed for this experiment, and basically wanted to test. It's somewhat indirect, but basically what is the sort of higher level interpretation that needs to be brought in for these illusions to work. So the first thing we did in that manipulation, just look at these ones here, is inversion of the image. So the reason for this, there had been some literature suggesting that these kind of Ponzo illusions get weaker when you turn them upside down. And also actually one of our admin people had an open day kind of event. And so we had that cars illusion that I showed you earlier. And then she came to me, and I turned my head upside down, it goes away. I was like, what, really? And so then we decided to do this as an experiment. So yeah, basically inversion, just to see if the illusion is actually affected, but more importantly, is the V1 effect that's supposed to be there, is that actually following that same perceptual effect? And there are good reasons to think about inversion as messing with things like depth perception. So I think you probably all have heard of the face inversion effect. We know that for face perception, turning it upside down, it really is quite a fundamental perceptual issue, right? But inversion is much more broadly critical. This is a very nice illustration of this. So I don't know what you can see in this image, but for me, it's fortunately a bit blurry on the screen. But it looks like there's like a hill, and then in the background there's this tree, right? And it doesn't really quite make sense to me. The whole thing looks like the background is painted on somehow on a wall. Right? I totally lose my sort of understanding what this thing actually shows. And then when you turn it upside down, or rather the right side up, it immediately becomes clear, I think, that this is a rock that sticks out of a pond, and the tree is actually a reflection. And suddenly you get a much clearer idea about how far these objects are from you. right? So that it really messes with you, that seeing this sort of reflection / shadow of this going in that direction, it's much more consistent with our priors of how the environment should work. And this is such a fundamental effect that when you turn it back, I still don't see it, right? It's sort of know it's there, but you know, my perception is still of something that's sort of not quite right. And here's one that Adam found. So the same thing happens here. You know, this hopefully you see as this concave baking shape. Turn it upside down. I, for the life of me, cannot make sense of this image, right? I know what it is, but I see it as, you know, it's convex and this hole just makes no sense, right? It's just breaking, it's literally hurting my eyes. With this one, I somehow can see it like I see that one, right? Only for a fraction of a second, it flips back to normal, but this one I just can't, it just doesn't work. May not share the same experience, but properly see that it just feels very wrong, right? It's different. And again, this is probably something to do that we have sort of a prior to light come from a certain direction. The shadow shouldn't be sticking out at the top, right? So it has something to do with this, but basically inversion really messes things up. But then there's other things you can look at that involve higher level processing as well. So that she constructed these other kind of stimuli here, where here these sort of deconstructed versions of the road image, where we have this illusion. So here this car should look bigger than this, but yeah, here the boxes are same as the sizes of the cars. And here it implies some of the structure of the environment. Here it's just some lines, and this is basically a ponzo of that road, right? So just trying to take away more and more depth cues, more and more environmental cues, see what happens. I'll come back to the plane and these ones in a bit. So she measured these illusions, and basically what she found, yes, the inversion really breaks the illusion, but it doesn't remove it, right? But certainly with the road image, basically halves it. Ignore these for now, but in all the other cases, you know, the more you take away the kind of environmental cues that it's a real three-dimensional environment, the illusion itself gets much weaker. So the illusion itself has a lot to do with how we interpret the image, I think. But this inversion effect is present in all cases. The only cases where it's not present is these ones that were not based on the road, right? So here, just showed that in the previous. So here we have the ceiling where the ceiling lamps are in a corridor. So there the normal environmental interpretation, of course, would be that the thing should be at the top. And then you turn it upside down. And here the same thing, that the planes are in the sky. We expect them in the sky, so that natural interpretation is that's how the split vector should be. So in these cases, we actually, you know, it's the inversion of days. An implied inversion effect goes in the opposite direction, right? It's not significant, so I don't want to make too much of that. But it certainly cancels out the inversion effect we see for these kind of images. So what seems to be happening, so I mean, just to summarize, it's stronger illusion when the depth cues are stronger. There's an inversion effect. But we seem to have this preference to have that far object be at the top in the image, so that maybe we have some sort of prior to expect, you know, a perspective where we see the ground in front of us. And so the sort of things with the ceiling, the sky, they're still not actually that natural to us. But I mean, that's very much an open question, and you might have other ideas that explain it. Okay, but yeah, I'm going to gloss over this, but this is basically just the design we used to go in the scanner with this. So what we wanted to know is the V1 activity in V1, so obvious, which the V1 activity that we're measuring to these illusions, does that reflect this perceptual effect that we see with inversion? So, you know, we showed these car stimuli, and people were fitted, that's an important part, people were fixating on the car. Doesn't matter whether it's in the top or the bottom, right? Wherever it was appearing, that's where you fixated. So it's actually, in terms of low-level representation, nothing's changing. And we've had them as inverted or upright. And also there's a scrambled background as a control condition, so where there should be no illusion. And then we again used the kind of same approach that Mandy used. So we used population receptive field mapping to project the brain activity that we measured to the cars back into the visual field. And that's what you see up here. And what you can see, now first of all, in the, let's see, interpret this right. So these two are the illusion pictures. So when it's upright, we got the strongest, biggest activation that reaches the furthest. When it's inverted, that's substantially reduced, but it's still bigger than the actual car would have been. And for the scrambled, it's basically, it doesn't change very much. And the bottom images are just trying to look at it from the other angle to use this as an encoding model. So here we simulated, or we predicted for different car sizes, actual car sizes, right? What would be the brain activity that they should cause? And then we find the one that best explains the data we measured. And that again, it matches fairly closely the perceived difference in the cars that we get. So summary of all of that is that we get the V1 effect. It seems to match the perceptual effects we're getting. Not just, it's not just the illusion itself. We need to turn the illusion upside down. This V1 effect also goes down, but doesn't go away. And I think that's quite important because that implies, this is all mostly matched, right? It's really close to, actually it's really close to fixation. We're not moving around in the visual field or anything. So it really suggests that this is some sort of feedback signal that influences V1. Because what could have been the case is that, yes, okay, these illusions involve feedback, but we know from other stuff that showed, that maybe the ponzo includes some low-level things. They might be happening in V1, but then on top of that, there's this feedback, right? So if we had found an illusion effect, but no inversion effect in V1, that would have been my interpretation. And that's not the case. It really seems to follow that illusion. All right, so just before I finish, I'm gonna talk about how we still don't understand anything. So size perception is just really bizarre. This is called the Jastrow neutral illusion. And so you probably agree, you can play it if you have one of these train tracks, that's what children might do. You can literally do it in the real world. This one looks much smaller than this one, I think, right? And you obviously know these are the same curves, and you can move it down, and then suddenly that one is the small one. And you can sort of conceptualize why, you think there's some sort of imply a sort of radial, and it looks like the radial subtense is different, but why should you therefore see it as different? Like, why not see it veridically, right? It's very confusing. Okay, so another one I noticed when we moved to Auckland, and it is quite interesting. So both my wife and I, we instantly kept talking about this, because we noticed it as we moved around the city, especially we're looking for a house, looking at different neighborhoods, we're lots of different places. And then other people who had recently arrived, they mentioned it too. Didn't you find the Sky Tower is weird? But then a lot of locals, they just looked at you really like, huh? What are you talking about? Especially our undergraduate students. When I first did this project with them, I think they just looked at me blankly and like, sit. But I think that's partly because as students, they try to live close to campus. And so they actually probably didn't get that effect at first. But the pictures don't do this justice at all. So I'm not even sure what I'm showing. But so this is the Sky Tower. You see it across the water. You see it sort of really, it's very thin. You can see very little of it. So that's one thing. It's very thin, but it's tall. Like when you really see it, it stands out. There's really very little city around it, right? It's just the only thing, except for some high rises here. And they're not nearly as big, right? But then you look at it from other angles, things sort of seem to happen. So here, I think I would still say that it looks really tall and really thin and majestic. And in various places, it's just the perception of it really becomes messed. This is unfortunately the best picture I could find of this that for this illustration here. I actually need to dig back into it. There are better pictures, I'm sure. But basically, what seems to happen is that you walk around the city and suddenly you look at it and it's like, what's this squat little brown thing that you see over there? Right? It's down from where we live. There's a hill nearby. If you go up, it's bloody obvious. It's like this most iconic feature about the skyline. And then other places, it looks like this little fat thing, right? And it's very strange. And so actually, when you're in London, you go to see the Big Ben Tower, House of Parliament, you see a similar thing, right? And you don't see this from very far, so I don't think you can get quite the same effect. But when you actually go to the House of Parliament and you think the tower is actually much smaller and less impressive than I thought. It's a really amazing building, I think. But yeah, it's you sort of from photos you sometimes expect this should be this majestic tower, and then it's like it's weird. So I think these kind of things happen in other places, but never seen it as much as with the Sky Tower. And yeah, so I wanted to know why. And this was this fun little project that we did with honor students, I should say. But yeah, I want to talk about it anyway, because it's also the first time. So this was covered in New Zealand news, and the commentary and the way it was covered and a lot of things was so bizarre and sort of it lost the point of the paper. And I actually talk about the bit of science that's in it. So, but yeah, it was meant to be a fun project. It was a short and sweet article, which is a format that Perception has for this sort of thing. And they're actually supposed to not have data, so I actually broke that rule, but only by a bit. But so this is actually my initial experiment. So there's data just from me, and I was cycling or driving, depending on where it was, to various places, and then literally just judged what did I think of the tower. Is it short and fat, or short and wide, or is it tall and thin? And it took some other measures as well, but this is sort of the main message really, and that shows the same thing as the others. So the blue ones is where it sort of looks squat and short, and the yellow ones is where it looks tall and thin and really stands out from the rest. And you can sort of see that, you know, you look at the ones that are really far away, it looks like it's tall and thin, but the closer you get, you know, there's some exceptions here, for example, but well, one that's just, again, this is me. This is all my data. But certainly that's what seems to be happening for me. And of course, we wanted to know if it's actually happening more generally. So we did a lab-based version of the same thing. So there, the students actually took photos of the Sky Tower from lots of different places, many more than I had on this map there. And then we did a lab psychophysics study where we did various ways of trying to estimate what people thought of the tower. And the clearest is, again, this sort of descriptive response, you know. So there seemed to be a correlation between distance from the tower and how tall and sort of thin you experience it to be. And this is another way of measuring it that didn't show any effect. That was a true alternative false choice design compared to a reference place. And also they're trying to estimate the factor of how much bigger or smaller you saw it. That seemed to be not correlated. But then interestingly, we could also look at the altitude in this one. And here we found it's not as clear, but there is some relationship to these other measures we had here. But actually the higher up you are, where the photo is taken, rather, it seemed to sort of explain some of that variation. So yeah, it's probably not the whole story for why the Sky Tower looks weird, but it seems to have something to do with how far and maybe also how high you are when you look at it. So I'd like to understand this better, and this is very basic, so that actually doing an experiment, possibly in VR setting, where I can manipulate things in the environment itself, I think that would be quite interesting. So just to sum up, I think that we definitely found that some of these basic geometric illusions involve some low-level effects, including at least our version of the Miller-Lyer, which seems to be reflected in V1. we also found that receptive fields in neuron, we can measure with fMRI the adaptation to spatial frequency, that suggesting that two things are linked. But we also have evidence that some of these depth interpretation, they involve probably some more feedback processing into V1. So whatever happens in V1 is not just about low level processing. And the Sky Tower is weird. So if you come to EPC/APCV, need to practice that, which we're organizing in July next year, then you can maybe experience this for yourself. And you can tell me if I'm just insane, but yeah, that's it. And I want to thank my current lab members, and also Pasi that needs to be my. He now has a much more important job in the government, but yeah, everyone else is currently still in my lab.
Thanks so much, Sam. That was really, really interesting, and I love the example that you gave of the inversion. How that is to me the beautiful description of the scientific method, starting with a quirky observation of, oh, the inversion goes away if I turn my head upside down, to then doing a proper experiment to test that.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it seems like an obvious thing to think about, but you know, we didn't really think about it.
Yeah,
So somebody else
pointed out.
came by and said, "Have you noticed that?"
Yeah,
So
love that.
yeah, good to have conversations about these things.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, so questions from the floor, students encouraged, yeah. Daniel.
Thanks for sharing your amazing work. I want to ask a question regarding your illusion. So I feel like in your illusion, the near object looks smaller than the far one, but I think it should be opposite, because for example, I'm sitting here, this should be larger, look bigger than the first one. Why in your illusion, like why the first one is smaller than, sorry, the near one is smaller than the far one?
Yeah, so that's the sort of explanation people have given for that effect, right? That of course in the real world, right, we have size constancy, right? We think something that's far away we know it looks smaller, right? Because if it's the same thing, if Martha is here or if she's way over there, it should be much, much smaller. So if she's like this and standing here, then something would be really weird, right? So and our brain does that, right? And so, I mean, I also agree that's probably part of why this higher level processing is involved, right? That's exactly what the brain's trying to do. But the thing is, it's not actually explaining the effect of the illusion, right? Because if it were simply just about interpreting how far something is, then we should see it as way, way bigger, much, much smaller than the illusion actually is, right? So it's not just that. It's sort of a breakdown of that process, I think, that it's a bit like the inversion effect, right? It's messes with the perception, right? It's just, it's not like your size constant doesn't explain the effect. It's clearly that's part of the problem, right? But it's a breakdown of size constant. It's not the size constant itself that's causing it.
And also, like for example, in your experiment, both like the image are fixed. If I move move the object from near to far, how is going to affect the perception when things are moving? If car is moving, so how is going to affect the perception?
It's actually, I mean, it's very obvious to think that with a car. Actually, I don't know. Nobody's done that as far as I know. But yeah, I mean, I know that. I mean, when you do move stimuli in the sort of you do experience that illusion, right? It does literally warp your perception of it. I haven't seen it with the cars, but that's actually very obvious thing that should be done. It should be doable, right?
Leila?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for your great talk. Sorry, I have two live questions. The first one is in the inversion task that you had. I have no idea, but have you looked at where your participants look first? Did you have any could you measure where they gaze, look where they fixation? Then you can find out
No, we haven't. That's, I mean, we, remember, see it, so are you talking about the rock or the?
Sorry, no, those like road and then
Yeah,
those.
no, I mean, so with this one, we didn't, there was no eye tracking in that one. And of course, I mean, the way these so certainly in the scanner, and he wanted to actually keep people fixating in a particular location, right? So that's for that analysis that we did to work, we need to know where people were looking. So we actually forced them to look at a particular location. But I think that, I mean, it's a very interesting question, and we could do an eye tracking experiment to see what people actually do. But I think that I'd be surprised if there's not a difference in that as well with the inversion, right? That it messes with what you're seeing, so you're probably looking at different places as well.
We might be scanning a bit more
Yeah.
to make sense of it.
Sorry, just one short
Yeah.
question. Sorry. In the last experiment that you did, so when you wanted to compare to control homogeneity, do you just look at the spatial frequency and like familiarity, or like you just consider that they know where is the Sky Tower, and then you just compare different images with different spatial frequency?
Sorry, wait, I missed.
Sorry,
the beginning
in
of
this
that.
in the Sky Tower,
Yeah.
how you control different images, spatial frequencies.
Oh, so yeah, we didn't. So as I said, this was very basic experiment. But yeah, we did try to do these different tasks where we, try to do different measures of. It's quite qualitative, asking people how they experienced it. But yeah, there was no control over the image factors other than, I mean, the Sky Tower had to be in the middle of the picture. So, well, approximately, they literally went around the place and took photos, right? So, but yeah, there was some constraints about how we take the picture, but I mean, it wasn't filtered or anything. There was no matching on beyond that, really.
What's your name again, Celine?
So really interesting talk, and I was wondering, in the inversion and the sky dark illusions, would you also consider that maybe the angle has an effect on how people perceive it? So not just the distance, but the angle that people view it at, because in inversion, the angle would sort of flip. Like if you view, like let's say on a straight line, the angle is 180. So if someone's viewing it at 30 degrees, then if you flip it, it might be on 60. So do you think that has an effect on the illusion no longer being so strong? And same for like the sky dark, the angle of elevation or the angle of depression. Do you think it has?
I think the distance, the elevation effect we're seeing is probably related to that. Yeah, I mean, actually, should have really analyzed this more. But I mean, it could even be something about what blocks the environment, right? So when you're higher up, you might see more of it. Simply, I mean, that's definitely an open question that would be worth pursuing. Yeah. I mean, there's another thing that I think is also playing a role. It's probably where you look at it, the direction. That
Yeah,
probably
sort
matters,
of like
right?
like if you visualize it from a trigonometric perspective, sort of the hypotenuse, and not just the straight distance, but the angular distance, maybe.
Yeah. No, that's a good point.
Paul?
Hello, psychophysicist.
Yeah.
Great talk. The last tower illusion strikes me as a horizon effect. So in terms of like the Weber Fechner function, right? That it's the size of the tower relative to the horizon as a ratio, and that where you are in terms of the elevation, that's going to change, which explains the angle effect.
Yeah.
And so have you looked at that data in terms of their proportionate ratios? Because I would expect that in terms of like the correlations, you wouldn't see a linear correlation. You would see basically like a power law.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think it's the one that's, I mean, the one here, right?
Yeah.
That actually
Yeah.
looks like a power effect.
That looks like a
but that's
visual
actually not the proportional one. So the proportional one is actually this one. And
Right.
we sort of, I mean, this is, the question here was, if I remember correctly, this was judged how next to the nearest tallest thing, how much
Oh.
bigger or smaller is it? That's what they, so this is a slider that they used.
So,
So I guess it's, that question is, so we wanted to have it, what is it sort of relative to its environment? And so that may not be quite the same as the horizon.
the horizon
I think
is probably
that's-
the
yeah.
one. It would be worth thinking about in terms of the flipping as well, because that's the same effect. You're moving the horizon line.
Yeah.
And from other psychophysics stuff, there's known effects because of where we look for gravity. We always look
Yeah,
down.
yeah, exactly.
So it makes sense that you do everything as a relative to horizon to down. So yeah, it's really nice, interesting work.
Yeah, I mean, that, as I said, this is very much a tiny little honors project. And so I always try to come, I'm in optometry and vision science, so I've had some psychology honors students, they spend a whole year, they're very dedicated to the project, but in optometry they won't have the same luxury. They do it in groups, and they have lots of other obligations. They do all this good clinical training. So they have a very different, they have very different time commitment. And then also they have very little experience with anything to do with the research before they come in, and the sort of methods, the statistics, all of that. So, the first one I did was an MRI project, and I would never do that again. But it's like there's no time, can't explain anything. They can't run the analysis because they don't have the computers. And it's like, yeah, I always try to find something that they find fun, that's even though it's not optometry. So yeah, it worked out well. Made it into the news. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the news too much, but the biggest thing was to take home messages, right? It looks bigger when you're far away, and that's not what you expect from the normal world, right? But then somehow I think they did it right, but the news themselves are fine. It's just that somehow it sort of conveyed, it's like, oh, the researchers found that things far away look small. It's like, no, that's not what we found.
I think that's a
Exactly
very
the
common
opposite.
process with
Yeah.
the media, distorting not size but content.
Okay, I think we are well fed in our brain, and we will now feed the other brain. So thanks again, Sam, for a great talk.